The massive orbital station hung in the darkness of space like a skeletal hand, its metal fingers reaching out to grab anything within its grasp. This was the Scrapyard Station, orbiting the distant planet Kepler 442b, where the galaxy's unwanted vessels came to die. Every day, old ships arrived here to be torn apart, their metal melted down, their tech salvaged for whatever value remained. It was a graveyard for the forgotten and the obsolete. Station Commander Vex there stood on the observation deck, watching another vessel make its final approach. The Valiant, a human-built frigate that had once served with honor in humanity's early days of space exploration. Now it was just another piece of junk, too old to be useful, too outdated to compete with the sleek, advanced warships that dominated the galaxy. The commander didn't give it a second thought. In his mind, human technology was quaint, almost laughable compared to what the Kutran Dominion and other advanced civilizations had created. The Valiant would be crushed, melted, and recycled like dozens of other vessels before it. But down in the lower docks, where the real work happened, things were different. James Mitchell stood with a cutting torch in his hand, watching the Valiant settle into the docking bay. He was a lean man in his 50s, with weathered hands that had spent 40 years keeping Navy ships operational. His face showed the lines of someone who had spent most of his life in the engine rooms and mechanical sections of warships. He'd been a lieutenant once, back when humanity still had pride in its military. Now he was just another contractor, another pair of hands to help tear apart old ships and sell their parts to whoever had the credits. But James wasn't like the other workers around him. While they grabbed their cutting tools and plasma shears, ready to slice the Valiant into manageable chunks, James moved slowly around the vessel. He studied it. He walked its exterior corridors, his fingers running across the hull plating. Most people would see just an old ship, outdated and weak. James saw something different. He saw the craftsmanship of human hands, the practical engineering of a species that couldn't afford to make mistakes. He saw a ship that had been built to last, built to work even when everything else failed. The other workers ignored him. They were paid by the ton of material they processed, so they worked fast without thinking. They cut into the outer walls, tearing open the Valiant's body to reach the valuable components inside. But James moved with purpose, with calculation. He wanted to understand this ship before it was destroyed. What? He wasn't entirely sure himself. Maybe it was nostalgia. Maybe it was the old soldier in him that refused to let a good piece of human engineering be ground into dust without acknowledgement. He managed to slip inside during a shift change, moving through the quiet corridors of the Valiant. The ship was dead, its systems powered down to almost nothing. But as James made his way deeper, he realized something that most people never would have noticed. The ship's core systems, the fundamental systems that kept a vessel running, weren't destroyed. They were dormant, sleeping. It was as if the Valiant was just waiting for someone to wake it up again. James's heart began to beat faster. His military training kicked in, that old instinct that had kept him alive through decades of service. He started documenting what he saw, writing down everything in a small notebook he kept hidden in his pocket. The power distribution system was intact. The reactor core was shut down but undamaged. The navigation systems were old but sophisticated in their own way. The weapon systems were locked and sealed, but they were there, waiting. This ship could run again. This ship could fight again. All it needed was someone who understood it, someone who cared enough to restore it. Over the next few days, James moved carefully through the Valiant, always staying hidden, always watching when the other workers weren't looking. He filled his notebook with schematics, power flows, system connections. He began to understand the ship like an old musician understanding a beloved instrument. He knew every quirk, every strength, every potential weakness. But James wasn't just being nostalgic. Something was happening in the galaxy that scared him. News was spreading quietly among the workers. Rumors about the Kutran Dominion beginning to conscript human colonies. Not asking for volunteers. Conscripting. Taking people by force, forcing them into labor, into servitude. And according to the whispers, his homeworld, the colony where his sister still lived, was next on the list. James stood in the quiet darkness of the Valiant's command deck, staring at the blank screens and inactive controls. His old instincts were stirring now, the part of him that had been a soldier, that had sworn to protect his people. As he looked around at the dormant ship, a dangerous idea began forming in his mind. An idea that would change everything. The scrapyard fell silent once the day shift ended. Most workers clocked out and headed to their quarters or the station's small recreational areas. But James Mitchell stayed behind. He told his supervisor he had extra maintenance work to do, and nobody questioned it. Why would they? He was just a contractor, a quiet older man doing his job. Nobody paid attention to him, and that was exactly what he needed. Night after night, James moved through the Valiant alone. He brought tools with him, small pieces at a time, nothing obvious that would draw attention. He had a plan now, a real plan. He wasn't just documenting the ship anymore. He was going to fix it. He was going to bring it back to life. The first thing James tackled was the power system. The reactor was shut down, but it wasn't broken. He studied the manual controls, running his weathered hands over the switches and dials. Most modern ships relied on computers to manage their reactor systems, complex algorithms that controlled every tiny detail. But the Valiant was different. It was built so that a human could manage it, could run the whole thing with hands-on controls if necessary. This was human engineering at its best. Practical, reliable, built to survive even when everything else failed. James activated the reactor core using the manual override system. The ship trembled slightly as power began flowing through its veins for the first time in months. Lights flickered on in the corridors, dim at first, then growing brighter. James stood there watching, his eyes reflecting the returning glow, feeling something he hadn't felt in years. He was bringing something dead back to life. But the reactor was just the beginning. The Valiant systems were interconnected, and many of the connections had been damaged during the years of neglect. Wires were corroded. Components had failed. The ship's computer systems were ancient by modern standards, but that actually worked in James's favor. They were simple enough to understand, simple enough to fix with basic tools and old-fashioned troubleshooting. He worked methodically night after night. The navigation systems came next. James rewired connections, replaced damaged circuit boards with salvaged components he'd carefully collected from other parts of the scrapyard. The Valiant had been stripped of many valuable parts, but the core components, the things that made the ship actually run, were still there. He just had to connect them, repair them, wake them up. The communication systems were trickier. These had been deliberately disabled, their frequencies locked out so the old ship couldn't transmit anything. But James understood the logic behind the old technology. He found the manual override codes buried in the ship's documentation. His fingers flew across the controls as he bypassed the locks, carefully, methodically, making sure he didn't trigger any alarms that might alert station security. As the weeks passed, the Valiant transformed. It went from a dead husk to something that actually resembled a functioning spacecraft. Power flowed through its systems. Lights came on throughout the corridors. The life support systems rumbled to life, filling the air with breathable atmosphere. James even got the internal gravity generators working again, that subtle pull that made walking on the deck feel natural instead of floating aimlessly in microgravity. But while James worked in the quiet darkness of the ship, news reached the scrapyard that made his blood run cold. It came through worker chatter, through messages people received from family and friends on the human colonies. The Kutran Dominion was moving forward with its conscription program. They weren't asking for volunteers anymore. They were taking entire communities by force, separating people from their homes, forcing them into labor camps and military service. Entire colonies were being emptied out, their populations transported to Dominion-controlled worlds to work in mines, factories, and military installations. And James's homeworld was on the list. Not tomorrow, not next month, but soon. Within weeks, maybe just days if the Dominion kept moving at this pace. He heard one of the other workers talking about it during a break. The man's brother lived on Kepler's Hope, the colony where James's sister still lived. The man was trying to arrange transport to get there, to try to warn people, to try to help them escape before the Dominion arrived. But he knew it was probably already too late. That night, James worked faster than he ever had before. His hands moved with renewed urgency as he restored the final systems. He pushed the Valiant harder, asking it to work faster, to come back to life sooner. The ship responded, as if it understood the desperation in the man who was bringing it back from the dead. The weapon systems were locked down, sealed behind security protocols that took James hours to bypass. But he did it. He brought the targeting systems online. He verified that the old weapons still had power, still had ammunition stored in their magazines. The Valiant was becoming more than just a ship now. It was becoming a weapon. It was becoming hope. Time was running out, and James Mitchell knew exactly what he had to do. The Valiant had changed. Over the past weeks of careful restoration, it had transformed from a forgotten relic into something alive, something that hummed with purpose. James could feel it now as he moved through the corridors. The ship was no longer dead. It was awakening. He stood in the command center, his fingers moving across displays that had been dark for so long. The main reactor pulsed with steady energy, its rhythm like a heartbeat. The ship's internal systems synchronized, each one feeding power to the next in a carefully orchestrated dance of engineering that James had painstakingly restored. Lights illuminated the command deck, casting long shadows across the ancient control stations. Outside the viewport, the scrapyard station hung in the darkness, massive and indifferent to what was happening inside one of its forgotten vessels. James initiated the final diagnostics. This was the moment of truth. Everything he'd worked for over these long nights came down to this. He needed to know if the Valiant could actually function, if it could do more than just turn on. He needed to know if it could fight. The navigation systems lit up first, displaying star charts and coordinates. The computer processed the data with surprising speed for such old technology. It was basic compared to modern systems, but it was reliable. It would work when newer, more complicated systems might fail. That was the beauty of human engineering from this era. It was built for survival, not for elegance. Next came the weapons diagnostics. This was what James had been most worried about. The targeting systems were ancient, designed around missile technology and kinetic projectiles. Modern warships used energy weapons, sophisticated systems that could adjust to moving targets in real time. But the Valiant didn't need to be as advanced as modern ships. It just needed to work. And as the targeting system came online, James felt his breath catch in his throat. It worked. The weapons were armed. The ammunition magazines showed full inventory. The Valiant was ready to fight. But then everything changed. Alarms blared throughout the scrapyard station. James's head snapped up, his attention torn away from the diagnostics. Through the viewport he saw movement. Ships. Multiple ships, sleek and dark, bearing the insignia of the Kutran Dominion. They moved with military precision, establishing positions around the station like wolves circling prey. James's stomach tightened. This was it. They were here earlier than expected. He rushed to the communication terminal and activated the station-wide broadcast. A voice boomed across the speakers in the harsh language of the Dominion, speaking in clipped, authoritative tones. It was an enforcement order. All human personnel on the station were to report immediately to the detention blocks. They were being conscripted into service. Resistance would not be tolerated. The message repeated over and over, cold and mechanical and final. James's jaw clenched. They weren't just here for his homeworld anymore. They were taking everyone. They were taking the workers at the scrapyard, people who had families, people who had lives and dreams and hopes. They were being rounded up like cattle, about to be transported to Dominion worlds to live out their lives in servitude. James moved with sudden, desperate speed. He made his way through the Valiant's corridors to the airlock that connected the ship to the docking ring. His hands worked the manual controls, the physical switches that no computer could override. He punched in the sequence that would disconnect the ship from the station. The Valiant had to separate. It had to break free. If it stayed docked, the Dominion would seize it, would drag it to their shipyards and dismantle it like they had so many other vessels. The airlock sealed with a hiss of pressurized air. James felt the ship shudder slightly as the docking clamps released. Through the viewport, he watched the station grow smaller, receding as the Valiant began to drift away. Below, on the station's docking platform, he could see Dominion soldiers moving through the corridors, herding frightened workers toward transport vessels. He could see people he'd worked alongside for months being forced at gunpoint into detention blocks. His hands moved to the engine controls. They were simple, mechanical, direct. No computer needed to interpret his intentions. He pushed the throttle forward, and the Valiant's main engines roared to life. The sound was magnificent, the deep, powerful rumble of fusion reactors pushing exotic fuel through reaction chambers. It was a sound like thunder, a sound like defiance, a sound like hope. The ship accelerated away from the station, faster and faster. The Dominion enforcement vessels turned to pursue, their trajectories shifting as they locked onto the Valiant's position. But they were reacting too slowly. The old human ship moved with an agility that surprised even James. It twisted and banked through space with a grace that made his hands feel sure, confident, alive. Behind him, the scrapyard station grew smaller and smaller until it was just a speck of light against the darkness. Ahead, the infinite expanse of space opened up before the Valiant like a promise. James gripped the controls as alarms blared in warning, as pursuit ships closed in on an intercept course. The old ship hummed beneath his hands, alive and ready, carrying one human and the dreams of an entire species forward into whatever came next. The first warning came as a red flash on James's targeting screen. 3 Dominion corvettes had locked onto the Valiant, their weapons systems tracking the old human frigate as it raced through the darkness of space. James watched the data scroll across his displays, and for a moment he felt the weight of the impossible situation. 3 against 1. Modern military vessels against a ship that had been gathering dust in a scrapyard for years. But James didn't panic. He'd trained for combat situations decades ago, back when he was a young officer in the human navy. That training had never really left him. It lived in his muscles, in his instincts, in the way his hands moved across the controls without conscious thought. "Come on, old girl," he whispered to the Valiant, his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart. "Let's show them what you can do." The first energy blast came from the lead corvette, a bolt of pure destructive force that should have torn through the Valiant's shield generators like paper. But James was already moving. He'd anticipated the shot, reading the angle of the approaching ship, predicting where the weapons officer would aim. He banked hard to starboard, the Valiant's engines straining as he pushed them to maximum thrust. The energy bolt passed so close that James could feel the heat from it wash across the hull. The ship's shields flared, absorbing the worst of the radiation, but the vessel itself remained intact. The Dominion pilots seemed surprised. Their next shots came faster, more aggressive, but they were still relying on their targeting computers. James realized this was their weakness. The modern Dominion corvettes were sophisticated, their weapons systems advanced and precise. But they were also automatic, predictable. They locked onto a target and fired based on calculations, on projections of where their enemy would be. They assumed their targets would follow logical flight patterns because that's what computers understood. But James wasn't a computer. He was a human being with decades of experience, with instincts honed by years of training and intuition that couldn't be reduced to mathematical equations. He flew the Valiant in ways that didn't make perfect logical sense. He moved in directions that no automated system would predict. He pushed the old ship into maneuvers that were borderline reckless, cutting through the vacuum of space with wild, desperate grace. The Valiant's weapons systems were far less advanced than the Dominion corvettes. Where they had rapid-fire energy weapons and sophisticated targeting arrays, James had old-fashioned missiles and kinetic projectiles. But he had something they didn't have. He had proximity. He had angle. He had knowledge. James had spent weeks inside this ship, learning every system, every capability, every quirk. He knew exactly how hard the Valiant could turn without shaking itself apart. He knew which corridors would resonate with vibrations if he pushed the engines too hard. He knew the blind spots in the ship's sensor array, the places where the old detection equipment couldn't see properly. And more importantly, he understood something the Dominion pilots didn't. The Valiant's unorthodox design, the very thing that made it seem outdated and inferior, created blind spots in the Dominion corvette sensors. The human ship's hull was thick and irregular, not the sleek aerodynamic design of modern vessels. Its power distribution was spread throughout the structure in ways that seemed inefficient by contemporary standards. Its engine placement was asymmetrical. All of these things, which would have been marked as design flaws by modern engineers, actually created dead zones. Places where the Dominion sensor arrays couldn't get clean readings. Places where the Valiant could hide. James used these blind spots ruthlessly. He dove behind the lead corvette, positioning the Valiant in a spot where its targeting system should have locked onto him but didn't. The Dominion pilot panicked, firing blindly in the direction where the human ship should have been. James fired back, launching a salvo of missiles from the Valiant's weapon tubes. The Dominion corvette's point defense systems tried to intercept them, but they were too slow, too reactive. One missile got through, striking the corvette's starboard engine cluster. The explosion was brilliant and terrible. The Dominion corvette lurched sideways, its trajectory destabilized, its communication system screaming warnings. James didn't wait to see what happened next. He was already moving, already pushing the Valiant into another impossible maneuver, already positioning himself against the second corvette. The second corvette's pilot was faster, more experienced than the first. It anticipated James's movement and fired with devastating accuracy. But James had learned from the first engagement. He knew how these ships thought, how their weapons fired, how their pilots reacted. He wasn't just flying anymore. He was dancing, matching the Dominion corvette move for move, reading its intentions and countering them before they became reality. The Valiant's old computer systems processed targeting data in ways that seemed primitive compared to what the Dominion vessels used. But there was a purity to that simplicity. There was no hesitation, no second-guessing. James aimed and fired, and the missiles went where they were supposed to go. One after another, the corvette's defenses failed. One after another, James's weapons found their targets. The second corvette exploded in a cascade of light and debris. The third corvette, seeing two of its companions destroyed, attempted to retreat. But James had learned the Valiant's capabilities too well. He pursued, weapons blazing, and within minutes, the third corvette was limping away, its hull breached, its systems failing, its crew desperately trying to make it back to the Dominion fleet before the ship fell apart completely. When the silence came, it was complete and overwhelming. James sat alone in the command center of the Valiant, his hands shaking slightly from adrenaline. 3 Dominion corvettes. Modern military vessels. And he defeated them. Not through superior firepower or advanced technology, but through something far more powerful. Through human ingenuity. Through understanding. Through refusing to accept that he should lose. Within hours, the news began spreading across human colony networks. A single mechanic, flying a supposedly obsolete ship, had taken down 3 Dominion military vessels. The impossible had happened. And humanity had finally seen proof that they could fight back. The communication system of the Valiant came alive with voices. Message after message poured in, transmitted across encrypted channels that the Dominion hadn't figured out how to crack yet. James sat in the command center, listening to the words of people he'd never met, people from human colonies scattered across dozens of star systems. And they were all saying the same thing. They wanted to fight. They wanted to resist. The first message came from a woman named Catherine on the colony world of New Terra. She was an engineer, she said, and she'd seen the footage of the Valiant destroying those Dominion corvettes. She wanted to know how James had done it. More importantly, she wanted to know if it could be done again. If one old ship could change everything, what could a whole fleet of restored vessels do? Then came a message from a man named Robert on Kepler's Hope, the very colony where James's sister lived. Robert had been a military pilot before the Dominion arrived, before everything changed. He told James that people were waking up. They were remembering what it felt like to have hope. They were starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, they didn't have to accept the Dominion's domination as inevitable. The messages kept coming. Engineers from a dozen colonies. Pilots who'd been hiding, afraid to speak up. Mechanics who understood ships the way James understood ships. Soldiers who remembered their training, who remembered what it meant to fight for something. They all had the same request. Help us. Teach us. Show us how to do what you did. And then something extraordinary began to happen. In scrapyards across human space, old ships started disappearing. Not being processed for scrap, not being melted down and recycled, but actually disappearing. Later, James would learn what was happening. Engineers, inspired by his success, had infiltrated dozens of recycling facilities. They were doing exactly what James had done. They were finding old human vessels that had been written off as obsolete, and they were bringing them back to life. On a station orbiting the colony world of Haven, a woman named Rebecca led a team that restored a decommissioned human destroyer. It took them 3 months, but when they finished, that ship was ready for combat. On another station, near the outer colonies, a group of mechanics brought a cruiser back from the dead. Then another ship. Then another. Each restoration took time, took dedication, took people who believed in what they were doing even when it seemed impossible. James received encrypted transmissions with technical specifications, with progress reports, with questions about systems that had broken during restoration. He answered every one. He became an unofficial teacher for a growing movement of people who were learning how to resurrect human military power from the graveyard of forgotten technology. The Dominion, meanwhile, seemed confused by what was happening. Their military commanders couldn't understand how humans could be building a resistance fleet. Where were they getting the ships? How were they acquiring the weapons? The Dominion had assumed that humanity's military capability had been permanently broken, permanently scattered. They hadn't anticipated this. They hadn't anticipated that humans would look at the things they'd been told were worthless and see value instead. The Valiant itself became more than just a ship. It became a symbol. Other human pilots started calling it the Phoenix, a name that caught on across the colonies because it felt right. A ship that had been dead, left to decay in a graveyard, had risen again and struck back at the oppressors. The message was clear. Humanity wasn't finished. Humanity could adapt. Humanity could fight back with ingenuity and determination when everything else failed. James began to understand something deeper about his species. The Dominion had superior technology, yes. They had more ships, more weapons, more resources. But they didn't have what humans had. They didn't have the ability to see potential where others saw only failure. They didn't have the stubborn refusal to accept that something was finished just because someone in authority said it was finished. They didn't have the capacity to innovate out of desperation, to create solutions that weren't in any manual because the manuals didn't exist yet. Human engineers weren't constrained by the same logical frameworks as the Dominion's computer systems. When a system broke, they didn't consult databases to find the approved solution. They looked at what they had, understood what they needed, and figured out how to bridge the gap. Sometimes their solutions were unconventional. Sometimes they were messy. But they worked. And that was what mattered. As weeks turned into months, James found himself leading something he'd never intended to lead. A resistance. A movement. A quiet revolution that was spreading through human space like wildfire. He received reports of 17 decommissioned ships brought back into service. Then 23. Then 35. Each one piloted by humans who refused to accept defeat. Each one crewed by people who had decided that the Dominion's domination was not inevitable. James charted a new course for the Valiant. He was heading toward Kepler's Hope, toward the colony where his sister lived. The Dominion forces there were reinforcing their positions, preparing for resistance, but they didn't know what was coming. They didn't know that a fleet of old human ships they'd assumed were worthless, was converging on their position. The Valiant's engines hummed beneath his hands, powerful and purposeful. James could feel the weight of what was happening, the significance of this moment. This wasn't just about him and his ship anymore. This was about humanity's future. This was about proving that sometimes, the most powerful weapon wasn't the newest technology or the most advanced system. Sometimes the most powerful weapon was the refusal to accept defeat. Sometimes it was hope. And as the old frigate pushed forward through the darkness of space, its engines roaring with renewed purpose, James Mitchell understood that he had become the spark that would ignite humanity's reckoning with the Dominion. And it had all started with one mechanic and a piece of scrap metal that refused to stay dead.